Hi everybody, this is Mrs. Mancuso. This is evolution video number 3. We are going to talk all about speciation and what it means to be a species, how species are formed, and how they are reproductively isolated. Alright, so we're going to start here with speciation, and that just means forming a new species, and then of course we need to define the word species. So a species is a group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding, and when they mate, they produce viable, which means living, fertile, which means that they have reproductive capacity, they can have offspring. So if you have two populations and they can't mate with each other, they are separate species. Now, if they can mate with each other, but the offspring that they have either don't survive or aren't capable of reproducing, then they're also considered different species. All right, let's move on here. First type of speciation is called allopatric. I want you to think of that capital A like a big mountain range. So picture the letter A really dividing a population. So allopatric speciation is the division of a population into two different species because they're geographically isolated. Now what happens, it's not just that they're separated, it's that each area. So let's say we have a mountain range here and I've got population A here and population B here. Because they're separated and because their environments are now going to be different, there's going to be natural selection happening in each area. And the selection pressures are going to be different, which is going to lead to differential survival in each area. So the traits that accumulate on one side may be very different from the traits that accumulate on the other side. And those differences might be enough to separate the population into distinct species. And the way that you tell is you put them back in contact with each other, and if they do not mate and do not form viable, fertile offspring, then they have become two separate species. So if I go down here, I have some examples. This is just a drawn example. So here are some bugs, and the bugs are now separated by a body of water. And these two environments, so let's say this environment here is very sandy, and these beetles tend to live either on the dirt or in the sand, or maybe on the bark of trees. Whereas this population, let's say it's very grassy area that has divided. These ones, you have a better chance of surviving if you're green. So if we let the two populations, after a long period of time has passed, if we let them back in contact with each other and they do not mate, they have become two separate species. I have another example down here. This is an interesting study that was done by a woman. She compared these snapper shrimp, and the Isthmus of Panama converged, had a land formation 3 million years ago. So these used to be in the same body of water, and they were the same type of shrimp. But now that the water has been separated by the Panama, the country of Panama, now there are such differences in these that even if you put them in a similar tank, they'll fight with each other, they won't mate. All right, and then here's another one, and we've got this species of lizard being separated by this valley, and they have evolved changes certainly in their how their skin appears, and same thing, when brought back together, they had undergone too many changes, so they had become two separate species. All right, next type is called sympatric. So let me cover this up so that you're just writing a little bit at a time. So sympatric speciation, they are actually living in the same place. They're not geographically isolated. So there's got to be something going on right in that area that's causing them to become different. So one example is called balanced polymorphism. And we talked about polymorphism already, to have many different forms capable of existing in the same area. So if all of these little subspecies can survive, but but then they choose not to mate with each other, then they could become a different species. So if you have this one area, and let's say that only the bluebirds mate with the bluebirds and only the redbirds mate with the redbirds, those differences that were originally just variations in the species, if they tend to only mate with those and become so isolated that they form their own population, which eventually becomes their own species, that is speciation, even though they never left the area. They may all exist in the same place. All right, my next example, polyploidy. So poly means many, ploidy means sets of chromosomes. So instead of being haploid or diploid, these organisms have exhibited polyploidy. It's really the only way you're going to get a new species in a single generation, and it only works for plants. When animals have polyploidy, it causes miscarriage and they don't survive. Or if they don't miscarry, they usually don't live very long and they're not fertile. But in plants, it works, and often the plant species that survive that are polyploidy are actually even larger, which sort of makes sense. So it's how we came to get the wheat that we use today. So crossing of wild wheat that had one diploid number with another type of wild wheat that had another diploid number. You'd think that you couldn't even cross them, and you can't. When you cross them, you get a hybrid that's sterile. But if you double that chromosome number, you actually end up with bred wheat. So this is a great example of polyploidy. It gives you a whole new generation, a whole new species in a single generation. All right, next one, adaptive radiation. So this is when one original species, this is our third type. So first was allopatric, second was sympatric, this is adaptive radiation. That means when a single species branches into many different species all at once, it's usually due to a really different geographic area or really different like food sources that are available. So in islands, you tend to see this the most. So a great example is the Galapagos finches, really diverse conditions. These finches are relying on food, obviously, to survive like any other organism is. And when the population changes because of the condition on the island due to the foods that are available, this is what we ended up seeing. Here was the original mainland finch that was always, its niche was eating seeds, but now these different finches have taken on new niches, eating leaves, eating insects, eating buds, eating grubs, and using their beak as a tool. So these are all examples of species that formed from a single ancestor. So adaptive radiation. Radiation, think of like the sun and how there's lots of rays going out in different directions. Same is true with this picture like this. All right, next one. All right, so in order for speciation to occur, the populations have to be isolated. And to be isolated, we're talking about what are the things that happen to prevent them from actually mating. So we're preventing fertilization in these first 5. So there's 5 mechanisms that prevent 2 populations that have changed drastically from mating, and that's one of the reasons why they can stay separate species. So the first one is really easy to remember. They're in a different habitat. If they live in different places, they don't even think of each other as mates because they're not around each other. They don't come in contact with each other. The next one is called temporal, which is all about timing. So if their timing isn't the same, so for example, if one type of frog always mates between noon and 3, and another one always mates at dusk, they don't see each other as mating partners because they don't mate at the same time. Or animals that are nocturnal versus diurnal, that mate during the day, they are not going to see each other as mating partners because they're not out looking for mates at the same time of day. It can also be time of year. You can think of mums. They are flowering in the fall, and something like a tulip flowers in the spring. So they're definitely different species because they don't mate at the same time. That's one way that they're reproductively isolated. In this graph here, I really liked this because it shows, here's the different times of the year, and here's when each of these 4 different species of frogs mate. So their breeding time is very different, and that's why they are also different species. There is some crossover between each one as well, but they still don't choose each other as mates. Or here's another one, and these are 2 different types of pine trees. And so these pine trees have their pollination in different months. All right, next one is behavioral. If you don't recognize the song, the dance, the color, any of those special traits that are part of their behavioral ritual, maybe the smells that are released, then you're not going to choose each other as a mate and you'll be reproductively isolated. I put this picture, remember in the beginning of the year when I showed you the video on the blue-footed booby and the dance that they do. These birds, how they show off their feet and then they arch their backs and they do this dance to be chosen. All right, the fourth pre-zygotic isolating mechanism is mechanical, and that means that they actually, their genitalia don't match up, and so we look at these two dogs and say, oh yeah, they might actually be the same species, but those two populations are very mechanically isolated. They are not going to mate with each other. If they do try to mate and either the egg doesn't recognize the sperm or the sperm dies in the environment of the egg, that's called gametic isolation. It means the gametes can't live in the same place or don't recognize each other. So those five were all pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms. Our next one here, we're going to have three of these. They all start with the word hybrid, and hybrid is if you cross two very different populations. So post-zygotic means they already mated. So after a zygote has formed, what things could still isolate two populations? So the first one is called hybrid inviability. If you're inviable, you don't survive. So if these two very different populations actually mate, but the hybrid, the zygote, does not survive to birth, that is called hybrid inviability. The next one is called hybrid sterility. So you could have a mule, you could cross a horse and a donkey. They are two different species. They can mate, but their offspring is sterile. So if the offspring is sterile, it is not its own separate species. So the two original parents were not of the same species. Last one, hybrid breakdown. Hybrid breakdown is if you look into the next generation. So they were able to mate, they were able to have an offspring, but that offspring is not very successful with its children. So the grandkids, you could think of it like that. The grandkids either have a really low chance of surviving or a low chance of being able to reproduce. All right, patterns of evolution. So these are just trends that we have seen through fossils and through studying different organisms. The most common is divergent, which means you have one common ancestor here and a difference in traits, which could be due to allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation or adaptive radiation. They have led to differences, and we get this divergent. So divergent, two of them come from one ancestor. The next one, converge, means to come together. So the fact that things share common traits, but it's not due to a common ancestor, we call these analogous traits. So I like to think of the porpoise and the penguins and dolphins and sharks, all of those organisms that live in the water. They tend to survive because they have this torpedo-shaped body. So it's a selection pressure in the environment that they're in, but it's not due to a common ancestor. So having common traits is convergent. It just doesn't mean they came from something similar. Here's another example with these wings, but these all have different ancestors. They are not of the same lineage. All right, next one, parallel. Parallel means that divergence did occur, but then they went through some changes and they actually have become somewhat similar over time. So it's like they changed, but then they run parallel to each other. So here we have these birds. They definitely have diverged or diverged multiple times, but now look at how close they all look. You have to really look to notice the differences between them. All right, oops, sorry about that. Let's go back here. So we've got two screens left. The next one, coevolution. I really like this. It's thinking about how do one species affect changes in another species, and it again has to do with selection pressures. So as a prey population evolves, the predator populations evolve in response to it. So if you think about a lynx chasing down a hare, the hares that survive are the ones that blend in the most and can run the fastest, and then the lynx that are able to actually catch those are the ones that can then run faster. So it's like this constant change between the two populations in response to each other. Plants and plant-eating insects, I have a little picture right here, here's this bug, and it just blends right in. So obviously this had some strange mutations that allowed it to be this coloration and be this shape, which is awesome for the environment. It's certainly going to be selected for and survive and reproduce and pass on those genes. And then probably if these leaves change color, the ones that are going to survive are the ones that have that change in color. So that was the plant and plant-eating insects. Pollinators and flowering plants. That has to do with actually, if you think about when something like a bee goes into a flower to get nectar, there could be a difference in the insects or in birds, in the beaks and their ability to get into a flower. There are certain plants that are only pollinated by one type of insect or one type of bird, and they've basically evolved in response to each other, and they both have given each other a niche and a survival plan. Pathogens and the animal immune system is another example. Like we have E. coli in our intestines, and that allows us to survive. And the changes that we've undergone actually have affected the populations of E. coli and vice versa. All right, our last screen of the video. I'm going to sort of fly through this because I told you this category, origin of life. All right, so I told you that this category is just a small piece that we're just hardly touching the surface of. But if you think about what the early atmosphere must have been like, no oxygen in it, so it wasn't an oxidizing environment. Instead, it is a reducing environment. So if you remember from chemistry, oil rig, oxidation is losing electrons, reduction is gaining electrons. The atmosphere was a reducing, a gaining electron atmosphere. The first cells to exist were heterotrophs. They could not make their own food. Instead, they were eaters. And they were anaerobic because there's no oxygen. Next were the autotrophs. So next was the ability to actually use sunlight and create the first oxygen. So now the oxygen is available by the work of the autotrophs. So the last type of cell would be the heterotrophs that are aerobic, meaning they use the oxygen. And this guy, Stanley Miller, ran a whole bunch of experiments trying to recreate those first cells. So he used early atmospheric gases like sulfurs and sulfates and nitrates and hydrochloric acid and things like that. And he used heat and he used lightning. He used an electrical spark, but it was to represent lightning. And he called this batch of stuff his primordial soup, and it created the first macromolecules, so the first more complex organic molecules that existed, things like amino acids and possibly the first proteins. These are all like precursors of what cells would be. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Go to your textbook and get some good Cornell notes. Have a great day.